All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining. So we're here to talk today about VR platforms and managing rights in VR platforms. My name is John McGarrigan. I'm an associate in the Technology Transactions Group at Wilson Sonsini. And we have distinguished guests here. Jules Polonetsky, the CEO of the Future of Privacy Forum. Ruby Zeffo, who's the Chief Privacy Counsel at Intel. And Matt Burrows, who's the Director of Business and Legal Affairs at Jaunt. So I want to thank our panelists for joining us. Before we get started, I thought we'd take a little survey of the audience to see how many folks here have practices or work that touches VR specifically. Okay, so a fair amount, that's great. And of those folks, mostly on the hardware platform infrastructure side or the content side? So hardware platform, hands? No? Both? Okay. Content infrastructure. Okay. Great. Well, we're going to start by going down and letting our panelists introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their practices and how it relates to VR, and then we'll get into the meat. Matt, would you like to start?
Sure. So again, it's Matt Burrows. I'm with Jaunt, which is a VR startup based in San Mateo. Just moved there a couple months ago. Jaunt is really an end-to-end solution for VR. So we have a VR camera. We have a rendering platform, Jaunt Cloud Services. And then there's the content creation and then analytics to go with that. So we are about 4 years old, so really at the beginning of VR. And that's my immediate background. And then previously I was at Warner Brothers working on a movie sharing service, and then Apple prior to that.
I'm Ruby Zeffo. I'm a vice president at Intel in the legal department. And I'm the Chief Privacy and Security Counsel, so I'm all about privacy and security. My groups also support IT, and as of last week, our Artificial Intelligence Products Group. So far, my crossovers into VR have largely been about data and privacy and security. But I'm happy to tell you more about what our angle is when we do more of our overview.
I'm Jules Polonetsky. I'm the CEO of the Future of Privacy Forum. We're a think tank based in DC. My members are typically the privacy leads of about 140 or so companies, but as well a range of academics and advocates. We try to be the centrist voice in terms of data, being excited about the new things that can happen and how they add value to the world and consumers, but also making sure that the practices, laws, policies that can support those practices are in place. We've intersected with VR in a whole range of places and issues to some degree. Some subset of the issues are things that have come up over the years. I was the senior vice president for consumer advocacy at AOL, and so it's interesting to see how a host of the issues are very much community issues, obviously more intense in some ways because it's VR, but issues of avatars, issues of users interacting with each other, issues of the data around it. There's a long history that I think we are likely to be building on as we think through these policies. And then we've obviously worked with a number of the global tech folks who are part of our membership as they've started thinking about how do you integrate social media into VR as well as the other community issues.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. So my background is as a sort of content and media licensing lawyer. I thought I would start with a question for Matt around content clearance, and if you could talk a little bit about the ways that you view clearance of inbound content and media for use in a VR setting, how that differs from traditional media clearance and your experiences at
Sure.
For example, with Apple and Morin.
At a base level, the rights that we work with in the VR space generally overlap with traditional media. The distinction, I think, is really, and this I think is where we might see some change going forward, is on the rights clearance side, what platforms and so forth look at. So when either Jaunt goes out and films a VR piece, when I say film, by the way, I'm speaking of what we call cinematic VR, which is more, say, traditional Hollywood-type high-quality content, as opposed to, say, gameplay. But in that environment, for example, the various rights that are involved, such as, say, music rights, that typically when you go to license a piece of music in a film, there's featured music. Well, in the VR environment, you still have featured music, but when you have the headset on, any particular scene in that video potentially has a piece of featured and non-featured music. So if I'm looking at, say, straight ahead and I hear this song by Madonna, and that comes in very loud, then I turn off to the side, and then all of a sudden that Madonna song is no longer featured. Well, from a rights perspective, I mean, it's the same as if you were doing a linear piece of content. But that said, the rights holders want to be paid, say, more because of some songs, the featured song versus not featured. And so when those rights are cleared, that's invariably, I mean, the models aren't set up yet, but invariably over time, that will become more of an issue, I think. But that's more a matter of pricing. Other rights that come into play, just simply in terms of clearing content, say, for example, on the live space, if I'm to film downtown Palo Alto, and I've got my camera set up, that traditionally would be just somebody on the street and it's role play, that sort of thing. You would have the clearances for the actors, say, and people that are directly featured in that film. But with 360, all of a sudden now I'm getting everything behind me, everything in front of me, and so forth, and that's on the audio side, video, and so forth. And so when the rights get cleared, you're clearing for any sort of IP, trademarks, and so forth that appear in that footage, but you're also having to really just take a broader perspective. It's the same rights that come into play, but at the same time, you need to be much more conscious of that. And that comes about typically in post-production when the film is reviewed and needs to be cleared for the various marks that appear in there. So that's something else. And then what else? On the right side is when the video is actually captured, and then it goes through the rendering process, then there's a whole quality control process having to do with the stitching and whether or not that's done correctly or not. And that's really a function of, from a director's point of view, what are the standards? And at that point, or this point rather, we don't have that, and that's where this is really kind of a work in progress. So those are some of the issues that we deal with on the content creation side.
And that's so on the sort of traditional cinematic content side. Some of the VR experiences also get into potential for interaction and really authoring inside an environment, which leads to additional kind of concerns around what rights am I getting from those content providers or those media providers to enable and authorize my users to then work with that content in a different way. So out of curiosity, how sophisticated are you seeing the media providers with respect to understanding and working with and negotiating around these various kind of different aspects that come up in VR as opposed to traditional?
I would say it tends to follow the traditional media lines, meaning the large studios. And just to be upfront, Disney is an investor within John. And so it tends to be the larger companies which are more sophisticated about those rights. The smaller companies, I think, tend to be a little bit more loose about either the rights that they're capturing, the rights that they're giving, and so forth. But that's the sort of thing I think that will just evolve over time, just because, I mean, a larger media company has, say, in theory, much more to lose than a smaller company.
Sure, thanks. So from the media and content side, I wanted to ask Ruby from the hardware side, and particularly from a privacy standpoint, where do you, so where are the hardware products that support VR, where are they going? and what are the metrics that they enable collection of, and how do you see as a hardware provider, your role in helping that ecosystem sort of progress the technology while managing the sort of downstream uses and rights?
Yeah, so we have different angles on this. So we have a more traditional angle where, for example, we have our RealSense 3D cameras, which are something we provide to OEMs to put in their own systems, which, for example, one of the things we demo is education and books for children. If you have this technology, say, in a computer, it can sense the desktop, and the child can put objects that then get placed into the game. They can put themselves. It was actually kind of cute. We had this little girl on stage, and she put her hand in the game, and then we had the characters climbing up her arm, and we asked her if it tickled, and she said yes. Yes, it does tickle. So I guess that was a pretty good realistic experience for her, since she thought she could feel it. But we do the same with books, where the kid can then, interact with the characters, tickle the characters, things like that. But that's all an OEM play, so we don't really worry too much from the things that you're talking about. Now switch over to sports. We have a new sports group. My favorite thing out of this group is the 360-degree instant replay, because I care about accuracy in the calls. So to me, this does not ruin sports, it makes sports better. And you can see the view from any angle. I don't know if you've seen any of this in basketball or baseball, but you can see LeBron has been doing ads for us, and one, he's being filmed doing his thing, and then it cuts back, and we're like, wait a minute, go back to that. And we have superimposed a baby crying on his face, because he's kind of a crybaby. So this is really cool technology, but the future of it is even more interesting, because while the immediate goal is a really good fan experience, the longer term goal is to now insert some VR where the customer can customize the experience of watching a live event. So if it's a basketball game, maybe what I want to do is, all I want to do is watch what LeBron does the whole time. So I'm focusing all of my attention on him. I'm watching him from all the angles, something like that. Or maybe I care more about a certain, viewpoint from the arena, and I'm able to customize my viewing experience the way I want it. So from there, it's not a large leap to then improving virtual reality software games, to having virtual referees, to doing things like injury management better. I mean, it has a whole, once you're filming everything from every angle, you can imagine the different impacts that it's going to have. So then our question is, well, what's the business model around that? Because, the event owners own the event, and then when that's put in some kind of IP media, they still control it, right? The huge distribution and licensing fees for the broadcasters for that. So where does our experience come into play? Where's the revenue sharing model? The licensing is changing, since it's gone from radio and TV to a bunch of different online platforms. Can we sell virtual tickets to somebody for customizing their own experience? Like, how is content ownership and IP ownership and where the money flows happen going to change? And then with that, you have a crap ton of data. And it's both exciting, because you have to feed that data back into the system for it to learn.
Crap ton is more than an exabyte? Or?
That's a legal term. It's been
Technical
around
term.
since Blackstone. Look it up. So, that's what people are now worried about, right? Because you've got data all over the place. And this is where the arguments are going to come. Who owns the data? Who can use the data? And for what? And players are concerned, because they're worried they're going to be tracked, and their injuries are going to be tracked, their performance is going to be tracked. They're already worried about wearables for this reason. Sports teams are worried about competitors getting their hands on this information. Is that going to affect how competition works? Can it be used for health and wellness research? I mean, there are a lot of different reasons someone would want to get their hands on this data, but there aren't a lot of clear laws governing who has the right to it. I mean, it's in essence a public event, but it's not what people anticipate to be happening with that data in sort of the old school broadcasting world.
Let me build perhaps on Ruby's crap ton of data discussion to build out maybe with some additional detail some of the privacy issues. So the kind of data, obviously, that already is being described in various policies has started raising some concerns. You saw Senator Franken write to Oculus saying, why do you need this? And why do you need that? That sounds, and if you didn't know the industry, it would sound, sort of distressing. Why do you need information about the distance between people's eyes? Why do you need to do eye tracking, right? And so they had to, walk through offering. I was just rereading their response, offering a demo. I don't know if you ever took them up on the demo where it would be obvious why, somebody's hands need to be tracked, right? That's how the product works. But eye tracking, distance between eyes, dilation, face tracking, face detection, facial recognition, galvanic skin response, emotional state. Let's take voice just for a second. Obviously, we're all seeing the microphone in the home expanding, right? Whether it was the drop cam and other always-on devices, or devices that are not always on but are maybe always ready, the Echo and Google Home and now Apple's new product, all being called always on, right? Even though probably not a good idea to lump things that are not actually always sending data other than when they're awoke. Pretty big misconception that these things are listening all the time because we haven't done a good job at setting a terminology. So maybe we should not call things always on unless they're always on, because we're letting the always on things kind of sneak under the tent, right? If something really is always sending my data and always listening, I probably want to know. Maybe it's okay. Maybe it's my smart meter or a remote security camera, but I kind of want to know about that versus things that are voice ready, perhaps, always ready. And then probably the case that got the most attention, Samsung being accused of its smart TVs spying on people, was a device that actually isn't even always ready, but for which I have to physically pick up my remote, put my finger on a microphone button, see the microphone symbol come on the screen, at which for 12 or 15 seconds, I can tell it what to do, open up Netflix, raise the volume, and then it goes off, right? But that was described by a very smart technical expert who read the policy, and it said that, hey, when this is on, it's sending back data. Don't say anything in front of it that you don't want sent to us or to our third party, who actually is the one doing the analysis for us, right? Created global headlines, and everybody. And so when I go through my category of, wait a second, that's actually just voice controllable after I physically do something, right? The least likely to be sort of spying on me. So really important for us to set the terminology in advance. Otherwise, the story of a sheriff trying to get Echo stuff leaves with the notion that my devices are always spying on me. Okay, so let me get a little bit back to the VR, but the reality is these are the kinds of functions the Microsoft folks, I think, were smart when they did the Kinect early on, because of the fact that it interacted with users physically, and so did some interesting work to try to make sure that a lot of data stayed locally unless there was some reason to send it. And so to the extent that you're dealing with products or services, now is the time, I think, where people are actually finally trying to make smart decisions about, should this be always collecting and sending out data, in which case I'm in a certain situation. Do I want to keep data locally here and kind of get rid of it because it is going to be a 360 experience? And so again, bring it into VR. Is this an environment where we want to be collecting and capturing everything, or are some of these things ephemeral, even though in theory they are recordable? And so those sorts of important policy decisions, I think, are increasingly important to make. The data sets that I described, in Europe, many of them are going to be considered medical data. And I don't, say that casually. One of the major sports wellness products was required by the Dutch Data Authority, and this is just something that's counting steps. These things obviously by default will track your steps over time, right? Who wants to actually go in and flip a switch to learn how to make it track your steps over time? Like, you obviously want that. But if you look at this as medical data, then what right do you have to assume that this graphing and charting and tracking over time is something that you have permission to do? And so the Dutch regulator forced them to create separate permissions and separate opt-outs for each of the broken down functions, right? So yes, you can capture my steps during the day, but anything more than that, gives you wellness information and needs to be treated as, sensitive health information with the higher standards of permission and choice, right? So let's talk about this data, and all of a sudden you'll clearly see how being able to explain to the European regulator why this is a necessary on part of the product as opposed to something where people should be able to make micro decisions. You may not like the idea of kind of micro things that break up your user experience or are not default on to get the full product. And so the challenge is going to be either helping make the case that these are not medical for some reason, and maybe if you don't collect it over time or if you collect it in a way that is not going to be identifiable, maybe you have a case to make. But I think to the extent people are doing this globally, that's going to be an increasingly important piece. We can't monetize this unless we have some metrics. So in the session that's going on now, I assume people are learning about CPMs and click-through rates and so forth, the way ad tech is sold and tracked. Here, what seems to be emerging are things like gaze-through rates, right? But it's still early. The Internet Advertising Bureau has just done a sort of a report speculating, what are the likely metrics that might be there? What sort of ad formats are going to be acceptable? Does anybody kind of want a pop-up? Well, I don't know. I had to get rid of a pop-up the other day on my smart TV, to kind of click through some, it wasn't the terms, it was some like alternative home screen they were offering. And, your battery's always low and it's, you're like kind of clicking on it. It wasn't a delightful experience. I'm not sure that people want to, have to deal with intrusive experiences in virtual reality. And so the typical privacy issues that come along with ad tracking and cross-device to TV, obviously linking to this medium, if we have the success that I think many folks hope, the rest of the media world wants to know, well, how does this fit into the ad promoting it and the app download and the, how can I perform? I think we're only starting to see people thinking about ad tech delivery into these pieces right now. Am I right? Most of this is still done fairly, manually. There's not a, robust yet sort of third-party ad tech world, but that'll come along with its set of tracking identifiers. What of this data is okay for advertising, right? Clearly, in the online world, we have a set of rules that says if something's very sensitive, you're probably not supposed to make a behavioral profile for it unless you disclose that. So the Network Advertising Initiative, one of the self-regulatory bodies, says it's really too hard to distinguish between different kinds of diseases. Like maybe you think something is sensitive and someone else thinks asthma is not. So you can target people based on their visits to asthma sites or other types of medical type searches or information, but you need to list the ones you do on your site. So we're already using some fairly sensitive information about your browsing to determine what ad serving. So what here? So the only, I think, useful place that one could look for guidance so far, we worked with a number of folks in the industry to come up with a set of best practices for the data related to wearables, right? Because clearly folks who are looking to monetize or even prove that their ads work want some way to use that data. We were able to, I think, find that most companies were ready to agree that nobody wants to start getting ads on because their wellness tracker knows that it's a certain time of the month or how much they sweat or physical body information, right? The fact that you're using it, sure, right? But there's some really tricky questions. And the reason we were able to get people to agree, frankly, is that the platforms have set a pretty high bar, right? Both Apple and Google Play don't want, health kit information or some of the more sensitive information from wearables, used to be retargeting you sort of out there on the web. But there may be legitimate uses, right? I unfortunately have not been using my Runkeeper app much, but I put it on the other day and it told me that I got a personal best. Yeah, because it was like the first time I used it in like 3 months. But the reward I got for my personal best was a promotion, at a sports-related company, right? So they clearly were using information about my usage of the app. That didn't seem, over the top, right? But you can see how maybe more discrete information might not be as interesting. Anyway, lots more. But
maybe on that point, let me ask Matt, from your role as a platform and content provider, where do you see the role of industry in pushing the new norms on what people's expectations are, how you manage what people understand your platform to be doing. Obviously, as we've been talking about, that a VR platform can collect quite a lot of data that not everybody's perfectly, if they're not they may be aware of it, but not internalizing sort of what it means and what it can be used for. How do you see the role of Jaunt or other industry providers in sort of establishing and making those norms useful for consumers?
I think it's an essential question in that much of the VR space that we've been speaking about is, in a sense, playing off the same rules that we already have, say, for traditional media. Jules, you mentioned the wearable space and so forth. So there is a framework for all of this, but I mean the big differential. The big differentiator with VR is the amount of data that's being collected and the user experience, be it biometric data, be it from the end user point of view, to be able to interact and be able to hear a conversation from afar the people having that conversation, you wouldn't have expected that, or just to see somebody on a granular level. So all of these ideas, I think, are in many respects, again, just working off the same framework we already have. And so I think as things change over time, I mean, there's the privacy policy where the user is going to ostensibly accept to certain data being shared and so forth. But it's really, I think, a matter of expectation, so that consumer expectation is met. And that's really where it's incumbent upon the platforms and people that function in that space to educate their end users. And how does that come about? I mean, I think it's everything from when somebody goes onto your platform, just having a simple privacy policy. Okay, what data am I giving up? What are the consequences of this? And just really emphasizing that. And I think education over time will be key. And if we don't have that appropriate education, then that's, I think, where government steps in and provides regulation. And I don't think that the regulation will be a matter of so much as changing the law, so much as, when I say I think the regulation will be around changing the law, but it'll be around providing more sensitivity and awareness to end users so that they can really make a knowing, say, waiver around giving up certain data. And again, I think this is perhaps something on the, I wouldn't call it on the PR side, but in terms of relations to, again, to end users, it really everybody involved in that space needs to appreciate what's being collected, how the data is being shared, and so forth. But find means so that end users can appreciate what's happening. And if on the platform side, if we don't even appreciate what's being done in terms of data that's being collected and so forth, then that's our failing. And so that's something where we shouldn't even be collecting it if we have no intention of using it or we don't know what to use it for later on.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and it's already where the law is going. If you're European, you already know that less than a year from now, anybody doing business in Europe is going to have this new general data protection regulation coming, which does exactly that and gives more rights into the hands of individuals. But I've been telling people for years that the law is the bottom rung of what you need to do, because technology is moving faster than the laws are going to keep up with it, and it's going to keep doing that. So if you're paying attention to culture and the audience that you have and what their expectations are, their likelihood of complaining to a regulator is far less. And so, if you try to do the right thing, that goes a long way in an uncertain legal environment where there are no implementing regulations or anything else that give you really strict guidance. So I think it's always a good rule of thumb to start with policies on how you're going to handle data and respect the customer.
But I always argue you have to go a bit further, because I see lots of examples of people who had a good policy, they had a nice disclosure, and people just didn't pay attention. They didn't care, right? They were walking into a store, everything was fine. They didn't care to read the sign that said we're tracking phones in this way. because it just wasn't even on their radar screen. But then some critic, some advocate, media, somebody in government got all excited about it, and it wasn't clear what the rules were. Why were you doing this? Is it really defensible? And at the end of the day, there's a lot of scrambling, and then they end up perhaps agreeing to do things pretty much the way they were with a bit more this or a bit more of that. So if it's unclear out there what the norm is supposed to be in an area of new technology, I think you can do a reasonable job, and I usually trust that most companies, you see flips and flaps, but it's not hard to tell the product or consumer people, we tested that and people really don't seem to like it when we talk to them about it. People don't usually disastrously, sometimes they do, really annoy their users. They usually do things that their users don't seem to be paying attention, don't seem to care. And then all of a sudden everybody pays attention because it came up, and well, how dare you be doing that? And so helping set that norm by having that public conversation, setting those best practices, engaging, having that sort of argument at the industry group or the advocacy group level, like here's what this should look like, is a much better and safer place. And all too often, we've done that after there's been a blow up, right? Everybody was getting beat up about behavioral advertising, and the industry did rules around that, right? It took a big flap over Wi-Fi tracking for everybody to kind of say, well, wait, what should the rules be before Wi-Fi networks or location analytics providers sort of set rules there. It's really hard to do because people don't want to have that conversation in advance because you don't know what the full range of your product's going to be. You don't want to compromise and say, well, I'm going to take like 5% of what I wanted to do off the table. Or maybe you do because you're responsible, but there's a couple of other folks who don't, and so you can't really get any consensus. So it's really hard to do, but we've seen example after example where giant flops were created retroactively. I'll give you one example that I think will be relevant for VR, and I guarantee you'll see someone backtracking around this. Every 6 months, like clockwork, for the 20 years I've been dealing with privacy, there's a story because somebody reads a privacy policy or terms, maybe because some critic looked at it, maybe because they changed it and there was an update, but this language didn't change. And it says, you grant us a perpetual license to your blah, 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 right? And then for the next 16 days, the company is like, no, I don't really own your photos and have the right to really do everything I don't want. Ancestry just went through this a couple of weeks ago because they obviously have a licensing language in there, again, as typical in almost every policy that you see out there, granting themselves broad rights, but still obviously providing the user the right to delete it and the right to say no to various uses. So someone will, read the terms of some VR company and it'll say, we own what you do and what you say and blah, 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 because of the licensing rights that they'll think they need. Add that language now that sort of explains that you actually, don't have the right to make a feature film based on their particular, utterances without their permission, rather than explain it the day after. The reporters don't seem to care when they call up and you say, well, that's actually in your policy as well about like the comments and things that are posted. They don't say, oh, sorry, I guess it's not a big deal. They write the same story. So fix that language now. It's literally every 6 months. You can't name a company that hasn't gone through that.
So you raise an interesting point, though, Jules, that in platforms where you are allowing people to author or create something, right, they are creating something. They may own rights to those things that they create, but retention of ownership to those rights may or may not be all that meaningful if it's a closed platform that can't get things out of. So this may not be a new issue. It came up with Second Life, 10 years ago or so. But I think maybe the tools and the creations that are going to be built inside VR platforms may be more interesting and more sophisticated. Kind of gets back to the clearance issues we were talking about before. So when you are dealing with those passages in terms where you're saying, no, you do own things, you do have to be careful about what it means for someone to own the things that they create inside your platform, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that they have an ability to get it out. It may or may not mean that they have an ability to delete things. So managing that set of rights, both responsibly from a disclosure standpoint to avoid, avoidable fires, but also to be realistic and understand how your platform works and what that does and doesn't give your end users, I think is extremely important. So, but and on a similar topic, to back to something Ruby said earlier about establishing business models and trying to see where this is all going, and combining that with what we were just talking about norms around privacy. Norms can be, and regulations are, sort of location or jurisdiction specific. And so I know you and I had a conversation earlier. Your thoughts on how a business that is a global business approaches dealing with this aspect of privacy and regulation and cultural norms around what their business models are. How do you roll out a business when it's a moving target?
Yeah, it's hard, first of all, because it is a moving target, so there's a certain amount that's a leap of faith. But mostly when I hear people talk about it, it's a very on-off toggle switch. You either use the most conservative, experience ruining legal environment, and that's the way you launch, or you use the most freewheeling legal environment and risk massive fines in some other jurisdiction. It doesn't have to be an on or off switch. Typically what happens is these things are iterative. First of all, if you're a major company doing business in multiple jurisdictions and not a startup, trying something in a tiny place, it's going to be an iterative process. So you're going to have an idea and you're going to have a product you want to test out. I told you this a few minutes ago, I call it the 007 method because, first of all, I like looking at pictures of all the 007s. But if you see this graphic, there's, 8 or 10, however many there were, handsome guys. They're all dressed identically in tuxedos. They all have suave hair. They're all handsome. And if you took the face out, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart. And then, there's a formula in each movie, but it differs enough to keep us interested. That's the way I think about these products. You figure out what your initial launch is going to be, and I don't remember if it's Sean Connery or somebody else, but he's the best Bond, and I will hear no argument about that. So you start off with your Sean Connery, and because, say, in this particular instance, the U.S. has more, easier laws in terms of the data you're going to collect and how you're going to launch it, you try it out, and you start gathering the customer experience feedback, and you figure out if this is going to be a giant fail in the U.S. because people hate what it's gathering or how it's using the data. In Germany, you may as well not even give it a shot, right? So you decide on what your initial instantiation is going to be, and then you do enough manageable tweaks to it, to the jurisdictions you care enough about and where the ROI is enough to make it pay off.
I wonder whether we'll be thinking not just globally, but we'll be having to, given all the state legislation, whether we'll be tailoring some of these products to deal with different states, right? A number of states have made it illegal to do facial scans without written permission of the user. So there's a wonderful product, I think you guys own it now, called Orcam, belongs to Mobileye. I don't know if that came along with it, but it's a product that blind users can use to identify their friends or coworkers. You load up pictures of your friends or coworkers, and it will identify that, yes, this is your boss coming, this is your, people who you know. You are not necessarily getting written permission from them. They do have to stand in front of it. Clearly, you're getting their implied permission. Hey, can I load you into my Orcam? Okay, smile, right? But they're not getting kind of what the legislators thought of as sort of some sort of, click or some sort of approval. And frankly, what if you weren't taking a special picture for it? What if I literally was taking my, corporate directory or my, friends via Facebook or whatever other set of pictures so that I could identify if I was low vision or maybe somebody with a cognitive disability, right? And so,
or security purposes.
Or, security purposes. I don't know if do they exempt security in the Illinois or other laws? I don't know. They may exempt security, maybe not. So just want to note that it's, don't think of it just as an international compliance. Privacy has gone local in a lot of ways. A, because of some perception that the federal government isn't taking care of things. B, the states have always been quick to act, but now we're seeing local municipalities, cities, right? Oakland's got a council that helps, opine on some of the privacy issues. Seattle has a chief privacy officer. And so those folks are dealing with some of these technologies, not thinking necessarily VR, right? But they're thinking of, open data, and they're thinking of street cams and so forth. And some of these things are going to perhaps intersect with 360 video and some of these technologies.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
What I was going to also add, since this is about best practices and so forth, It's also interesting coming from the content provider standpoint, where something, say, 5 years ago, the data that a content provider or content platform would be collecting is, say, 5 subsets. Okay, so now in this VR space, we're now collecting, say, 10 or 100 or 1,000 pieces of data. And when we talk about, to your comment on state law, well, I mean, all of a sudden now biometric data becomes more relevant, say, to the content provider, whereas 5 years ago it didn't. Now we're collecting heart rate, we're collecting data around eye movement and so forth, and so it's almost that a company that was in the content provider space is now all of a sudden in the, now treated as a healthcare provider, and so what are the consequences of that? So just from a best practices viewpoint, it's really incumbent upon, I think, the attorney to really kind of broaden their viewpoint about the say, for instance, on data, the data that they are collecting and what categories are triggered by that.
It's not just data either. So if you have electronic devices, you have FCC regulation you have to worry about, and in the Europe you have CE, which you see on the back of the stuff. But also, like in our case, we have this issue with broadcasters. So if you're going to be a broadcast, like if you're now melding virtual and real experience, a real event, but you're trying to customize it. So to your ad point, for example, can't show a certain number of, there's a maximum number of ads you can show children. There's obscenity rules. There's closed captioning rules. There's, don't show tobacco ads. I mean, so you're in a whole different field that you may not have anticipated simply because you're trying to glom onto a live event.
So I want to save a couple of minutes for questions, but I have one final one for kind of anyone who wants to dive on this one, which is, and we haven't really gotten to talk about multi-user VR environments yet. Obviously, there are very interesting issues presented by the fact that in a multi-user environment where you can jump in and play a character, it's a double-edged sword, right? Lots of great things about being able to play a character, to take risks you wouldn't be able to take in real life, and to experience things that you don't allow yourself to do in real life. Obviously, the other side of that sword is that anonymity gives people, potentially a feeling of freedom that borders on an ability to behave badly. And so my question to all of you is where you think industry's role and what best practices are around establishing community inside VR communities because of the more immersive and more directly, interactive platform, how you promote and support the best parts of that anonymity while promoting community that has accountability. Anyone want to jump on that one?
Well, you probably all saw the blog post that got a lot of attention from the woman who reported what was the character who was harassing her? Big Bro 441 or something, who was virtually pawing at her in a game. And what I've seen some of the VR companies who haven't yet figured out how to deal with the fact that people will poke at each other and do things both appropriate and inappropriate. And so in one leading platform, if you get too close, poof, you as the close C blow up, and you have to go back and kind of log in. It's like a big pain in the neck, right? And so I think there's a lot of learning from community, right? You see sort of Twitter trying to catch up with, kind of what has overwhelmed because of a more open sense of what goes. At AOL, we were critiqued because we had a very heavy hand because we felt it was our responsibility to kind of, keep things all clean, and that was perhaps, too, rigid. It's been interesting to see how LinkedIn, as they've rolled out, blogging and so forth, they wanted to set a tone. They didn't want it to be, Facebook or Twitter. They wanted to kind of keep it to jobs and personal improvement. So they, gave the accounts initially to, designated VIPs and so forth. And it has, even though now it's open, as soon as someone kind of starts doing stuff that's too personal or promotes something, you see people sort of like pushing back. And so setting the norm, having those user controls, having clear terms that let you throw people off, don't think, and then again, there are going to be environments where the stuff is appropriate, right? The most popular rooms for years in Second Life were nude beaches, casinos, and places where folks dressed up as furries and interacted. And so,
Does that vary per culture or country, though?
or even per product, right? Like certain, sporting games, you may not want, certain kinds of interactions in the audience, and another platform may be a more licentious sort of environment.
So you're talking about a combination of technology, legal terms, business setting norms, and an approach to promoting a product for what it is or
And
what
we'll see
it's for.
people trying to hold the platforms responsible. So we'll have, the next round of tests to the CDA and Section 230, and presumably the law will hold. But when you have, pressure like on, is it Backpage for prostitution ads, and the company sort of battling that, when we see more extreme things perhaps happening, that are going to be more visceral, we'll presumably see courts sort of struggling with ways to maybe pierce 230 to kind of hold that. How can you let that really offensive thing, that just looks so ugly and is so, compelling for us to do something about?
Trying to draw a
Also,
distinction between speech and actual interaction.
What I was going to add to Jules, to your comment, and maybe perhaps I think you were alluding to this, is also just in terms of the business model. The companies, it would seem to me, the companies that would thrive in that environment are those that adhere to these quote unquote best practices. Those that don't would, nobody's going to want to go there, and they presumably would shut down, meaning people just wouldn't bring their business there. They wouldn't bring their identity there, and they would take their identity elsewhere. Which does raise another issue is on the security side. I think it's Phil Rosedale from Second Life has got a new venture which is open sourced and emphasizing being able to port your identity from one platform to another. And the question there is, okay, how secure is my identity? And then that brings up issues of identity theft, and can somebody steal your identity and so forth.
Your virtual identity or your real
Excuse me?
identity? Your virtual identity or your real identity?
Yeah, I mean, and eventually, I mean, the question that you presented was seemingly the virtual environment, but, perhaps you choose to allow your virtual to be real, right, or portions of that.
Somewhere
gonna
in
be
there it's
elements
tied to
across
your
the-
real
yeah,
identity.
exactly.
Somewhere in the system.
And if you are bringing in, right, the role of social media here or your friends list is really going to be important, right? Because maybe there's a space where you go into rooms with strangers, right? But it's probably in many places interesting to go into places where you are already, find your friends here, right? And so if content has been shared with me under one set of rules because of the social network, right? Maybe this was friends only. What's the model here? Is the model here, this is the real world, so I can show Ruby some pictures, from that a friend posted, even if she's not friends with them. And, we don't consider that outrageous. It's just like, respect kind of the rules. Or do I have to respect the Google or Facebook or whatever sharing settings came along when that person shared it here? So we're kind of intersecting. If I bring my identity from elsewhere, but there were privacy rules or other terms around that identity, does Google or Facebook or whoever say, sure, you can access, but you can only use it in certain ways, and you can't use it beyond that? Or is it not their issue because it represents the real world where you make decisions about what you share or what you don't share? Facebook doesn't tell me, if I print out a picture, who I can share it with. So if we didn't touch on a topic, I know we want to take some questions, but Mark Lemley has a phenomenal paper that is still a draft that sketches out a host of every grab bag issue that you can imagine that comes up in VR, and I recommend it's up draft on SSRN, so worth a look.
Well, we're approaching the end of our time here. Any questions from the audience before we thank our panelists? No?
I imagine if you Google the proper title of the paper, it'll show up. I don't know. Mark, what's the title of the draft?
It's called Log VR and AR. And I'm happy to send you a link. The paper's .ssrn.com will get you to and then get you to the research program.
Well, thank you all for joining us, and a huge thanks to Matt and Ruby and Jules. Thanks for coming.
Thank you all.